Hello, folks. Apparently you can hear me. Thank you for being here. I always remember going to see Jesse Schell at GDC, or at South by Southwest, the first time South by Southwest tried to do a game design program. And he said, there are 8 people in this room, but I have a feeling they're the right 8 people. And I always remember that story because I really expected to see 8 people in this room today to talk about user experience design. And I think I might be looking between 80 and 800. I come to you with a perfect storm. I blew a tire, the mechanic was late, 101 had an accident, and now I have the wrong slides. But I tell you what, I will do my very best, and you will ask me horrible, hard questions, which will make me weep, and then I will give you free copies of my book to say thank you. So, I've got 5 copies of a book. I hope that will gain me some goodwill. All right, so here we are together, and we're going to talk about user experience design, which is so odd for me because I have been doing user experience design for many, many years. When it was called HCI, when it was called information architecture, when it was called interaction design. I've been doing it throughout all these name changes. Someday, maybe you can explain to me why UX people have to rebrand themselves every few years. I'm not sure I fully understand that. But what's really weird to me is that you guys are hiring user experience designers now. And when I was asked to come here and speak about user experience design, I was kind of shocked, because I always thought you were designing experiences, right? You're already, okay, well, all right. And then I started talking to people, and I was sent a million screenshots, which I would love to show you, but I think you can imagine it, you know. The Witcher, some Final Fantasy things, like really horrifying menuing systems and heads-up displays that you can't even read because they're sitting on top of the same colored designs. I think that there's a lot of use that's forgotten in the idea of play. So, yeah, you would not work, wouldn't you? Come on, come on. Yes, well, apparently the finger is mightier than the clicky. Okay, so I teach now. I'm an associate professor of interaction design at California College of the Arts. I'm actually bringing the first game design courses to CCA, and with a little bit of luck, maybe even a minor. It's very exciting to teach this stuff. You know, Stone LeBrand stood on the stage last year and blew me away because he started talking about design, and that design was bigger than game. And he talked about Vitruvius. Vitruvius was the very first designer of anything. And he always talked about firmitas, utilitas, and venutas. I never say it right, but that just means usability and durability and beauty. So a thing has to actually, you know, if I sit on this table, it shouldn't break. I should know that I can sit upon it. And maybe most importantly, it should look good, of which this table has lost it. Actually, I wouldn't say that's most important. Possibly the most important is probably that it doesn't fall apart. Don Norman, who wrote The Design of Everyday Things, talked about the 3 stools. And this to me sounds just like Vitruvius. We're talking about feasible. Can we even build it? We're talking about desirable. Does anybody want us to build it? I advise a lot of startups in the Silicon Valley, and I will tell you that leg of the stool is the one that's most forgotten. And then viable. Can we build it and not go out of business doing it? That is also often forgotten. So this is Don himself. And something really interesting happened when Apple first got popular. So I don't know, are you familiar with the idea of cargo cults? Cargo cults, yes. Cargo cults in the South Pacific, there are a bunch of islanders, and when the Americans were there, they would drop cargo there, and they would get food. And when the Americans left at the end of World War II, they built all these stick airplanes and all these pretend airports with real runways. And they thought if they made the gods happy and they built these icons to the gods would bring cargo to them. And when Apple very first launched their successful products like the iPod and then eventually the iPhone, what did we see? People started making white phones, and people started making white everything. You know, apparently if you made things white, the consumers would buy it, and they put I in front of it. There's the iBud and the iBod and this. iBod is a vibrator, by the way, you know, fun fact. Apparently, if you look like Apple, you can sell happiness in all sorts of interesting ways. That's also user experience design. So This is what happens when my slides are wrong. I'm just going to make stuff up today. So Don is the fellow who actually coined the term user experience design. And what he said was that user experience encompasses all aspects of the user's experience and interactions with the company. And so what we have now is a whole generation of user experience designers who think they're supposed to design the customer care and the marketing plan as well as the actual interface. I think Amazon is a really good example of somebody who understands Don's vision for what user experience is actually supposed to be. So if you look at Amazon, it's one of the only places where I can get Tom Stoppard plays. They're wonderful with the long tail, right? They're able to take care of all sorts of pleasure. But they also know things about me with their recommendation systems, which is fairly incredible. You know, the fact that Amazon knows me well enough to know Linda Carter is very important to me is something I find very touching and increases my loyalty. And of course, it's all about the smiling boxes. Like, nothing's better than coming home to a big smile, right? And then there's the customer service piece, you know. When the Kindle launched, it had this lady that you could click on her face and suddenly somebody was talking to you. And any problem could be answered instantly. And this was a great way to start nibbling away at the Apple iPad market. So the first requirement is it has to meet the exact needs of the customer. What are the exact needs of the customer? Well, one thing I think Amazon does that's a little bit magical is the day I saw subscriptions. Now, they could have just said, people buy these things over and over again. Let's just get them to subscribe. But in this particular case, they actually predicted how often I would need to buy it. I have no idea how often I need razors, but they did. And finally, a joy to use. This is the stuff you guys get. You understand perfectly. This is the stuff the user experience people don't always get. I find it fascinating that Google does doodles. Have you ever questioned this? If you ever study brand, you know there's one rule to brand, and it is do not mess with the mark. You do not change the mark. You do not resize the mark. You do not add things to the mark. And Google's like, why? Let's just do whatever we feel as long as it's fun and it's interesting. So they break a lot of rules. Amazon also breaks a lot of rules. I'm sure you guys have seen some of these wonderful joke reviews. Common sense says, let's get rid of these completely, right? This has got to be destroying our ability to do targeting. This is undermining our brand. We're trying to sell a bunch of different things. But instead, they let them live on. And I think these are a really, really wonderful way for the user to shape the interface, connect to it, believe in it. And I think that from the years I've been going to GDC, I think you guys often struggle with these questions. How much customization is the right customization? What are the rules? When can we allow these natural moments of excitement and interest to bubble up? And I think this is a very brave approach for them. As well, here we have, in order to achieve high-quality user experience in a company's offering, there must be a seamless merging of services of multiple disciplines. I think this is one of the ones that is almost impossible for anybody to get right. And for this one, I'm going to look at Mini Cooper. So I own a Mini Cooper. If you own a Mini Cooper, it's not just a car, it's a way of living in the world. It's a very beautiful thing. Everything to the beautiful round steering wheel, to the fact that the gas gauge is in the wrong place. And by the way, everybody who owns a Mini Cooper runs out of gas the first time on their first tank because the gas gauge is not where it's supposed to be. It's somewhere in the middle. But you don't care. You forgive the car. You move on. You love it more. It's a wonderful thing. Little moments like the fact that the top doesn't just go down. It can go halfway down, and your cat fits in it. The other thing is that they really did a good job of making this into a real phenomenon. They have the T-shirts, they have the music. This actually came out the same time that the iPod already put 1,000 songs in your pocket. They said, let's put every song we possibly can, but before Spotify, into your car, so you can actually have any song that you could possibly want to listen to in the car. They actually supported driving clubs. And I think that not all of you know which game is going to be a success, but if you have a good sense that you're going to build something that's going to be wildly popular, like Lego Dimensions recently, there's some brilliant work going on right there. They have the community, they have the toys, they have the video. Everything feeds into everything, which feeds into everything else. And there's a completeness to that user experience. I'm going to question whether a user experience designer could design the completeness of that user experience. Now, Jesse James Garrett is the guy who popularized the term. Don Norman may have coined it, but I think the reason we have user experience designer is this guy's reason. And by the way, I think this is the first GDC he's ever missed. He's always sitting there in the back, quiet and invisible. If he knew how many people would be in this room, I think he would have not skipped this year's. It's a design of anything independent of medium or cross-device with human experience as an explicit outcome and human engagement as an explicit goal. Now, I will tell you, I was on the Twitters last night, and his business partner was saying game design is a subset of user experience design. And I said, I promise to say that to the audience and time how long they laugh at me. I think that there is a really interesting question about what's the bigger and what's the smaller and what does it mean to design a complete experience. However, when he went ahead and modeled it out, he kind of held it down a little bit. He actually designed the experience of use. And I think this is the definition that is a lot more relevant to everybody in this room. How do we design the experience of use? You are already designing the experience of play, but play cannot be accessed without being able to use the interface, the HUD, everything else. So when we take a look at his model, we have everything from understanding users all the way up through visual design and information architecture. Again, wrong slides, apologizing for the size of the font, moving on with my life. I think the three key parts of designing for the actual use are user interface, information architecture, and interaction design. Now, I think 90% of you guys probably think that user experience is just user interface design. And I read a really fascinating Quora answer by Raf Koster, who I begged not to come today, because he said that user experience is mostly about designing an interface. And I think that is a huge loss, because we can't put lipstick on a pig, and I don't think we should spend the time doing that. So if we think about the entire user experience design, from marketing all the way to customer service, from the beginning to the end, I think it's really in that circle where you guys are going to choose to hire your user experience designers. So there are a lot of things that you should know that come out of the history of user experience design. Like I said, it used to be called HCI. I'm going to argue it's the exact same thing. There are some universal principles that are built off cognitive psychology. The Design of Everyday Things talks about them. Jeff Johnson's highly underrated GUI bloopers talks a lot about those psychological principles. His talk, Designing with the Mind in Mind, is available on the Googles, and it's very good to watch. But Alan Cooper, who wrote The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, said, like putting an Armani suit on Attila the Hun, we cannot, good interface design only classes up existing behavior, which means if you don't have the behavior right, you're just trying to make it look pretty. So one of the key concepts is affordances. And I think we see affordances all the time. If you've read The Design of Everyday Things, you cannot walk through a door without complaining about it. You want a handle to say pull. You want a flat surface to say push. My friend Erin Hoffman said Monument Valley is the most UX game she's ever played. I'm going to assume you've all played it. If you haven't, I'm so sorry. It's a beautiful game. It's tiny. You can actually play it to the end, which I think most game designers have given up on. But it is the most affordancy game I've ever seen in my life. You've got these handles that you can turn. You've got buttons that can be pushed. Everything moves. It's like when you're doing the beautiful direct manipulation of handling it with an iPod, it's one of the most satisfying experiences ever, because everything looks like it can be touched, and an iPod, everything can be touched, and you don't have that mouse intermediating for you, which is very satisfying. There was a huge fuss when Flat came out. So there was this big stylistic decision. And by the way, I think Apple is no longer a user experience company. I think they're a fashion company, because they gave up skeuomorphism, which makes buttons that look pushable, makes everything look like you can touch it, and made everything flat like a Mondrian. It was almost like one day they said, usability is out, but flat is beautiful, and let's go on to make everything pretty. And as well as that, they did it overnight, and all of a sudden you couldn't see any of the icons. Everything looked different. I have a wonderful video of a small child crying in the face of flat. But beyond just, no, I'm not kidding. Beyond flat, being pretty and being elegant, if it doesn't look pushable, all we need is like a little tiny bit of 3D and the buttons would read as buttons. This is another interesting example. So I have worked with A/B testing for probably 15 years. I was lucky I worked in search, I worked in Zynga, I worked at LinkedIn, I put in A/B testing systems, and I will tell you one of the most amazing things you can do is tell people what to do. You will make all your numbers go up right now if you simply put a label on that says, click here, and if the button looks buttonable, and if the text looks like you can write in it, it will change everything. What I found fascinating, and I haven't seen other people try this, is if you take the hints out of the box and put it underneath the box, you will increase data input. I've tested this A/B testing several times. I haven't seen anybody write it up, but it makes sense, right? Because if you have something fairly flat like this and you put the text in there, it looks like a button or an instruction that's been decorated. So simply saying, I am a form, maybe put a blinking cursor in there, it's an invitation, it's an affordance. Meaning, this is something I will say is always very confusing to me. I feel like there's a lack of understanding of the historical learning that we have built into our interfaces. So there's a wonderful expression from the book, I don't remember the name of the book, but it is, intuition is compressed experience. And I think intuition is compressed experience is the #1 thing to keep in mind when we are designing an interface that we wish to be intuitive. What does it mean to be intuitive? It means that we are using pre-existing interfaces and pre-existing metaphors. So, for example, it's very simple. You know, we should know what something loading looks like. A gray link means it's not available. A hot link means that it is available. Links, make them colorful, make them clickable. This is really, really basic stuff and gets thrown out. I've heard designers say, well, everybody knows just to run your mouse over, and when it turns into a finger, you can click it. Do we think we want our users trying to navigate by Braille? That seems unpleasant to me. Set expectations, meet expectations. This is one of the most important things that I can think of when we're trying to do UX design. So what's wonderful here is when we have a tweet, you click it, it'll actually give you a message. Facebook, as you know, will show you a preview about what you're actually going to send. It will show it at the top of your stream. What you may not know is when I went to put this behavior into the LinkedIn stream and get it designed, it turned out we had to do a hack. Because if you have a lot of connections, the top thing will not be your actual update. But if people don't see their update at the top of the stream, they will submit it over and over and over and over again. So what we had to do is we had to force push the update you just shared at the top to avoid duplicate updates. And otherwise, we didn't have enough real-time opportunity to disambiguate the extra updates. One of the things that I think AlphaBear does really beautifully is, you know, Spry Foxes, is they will give you an actual image of what it's going to look like on Facebook. So one of the fascinating things that we learned when I was working at LinkedIn is that people are terrified to share updates on LinkedIn. And I thought that was really funny. Don't you want to promote yourself? Don't you want to become a big, important person? And it turns out that people are scared of social cost of sharing. And having worked at Zynga, I will tell you that we interviewed a ton of people who would say, we cannot, we won't click on the shares anymore because my friends are yelling at me. So knowing what the update's going to look like, knowing how you can customize it, making sure that people can take care of their social credibility is incredibly important to be effective. So the feedback has to be set expectations, meet expectations, but also letting people shape their brand and their social circles. I'm going to skip this. Recognition over recall, this is another good one. So there's also been a lot of studies around the hamburger menu. So the hamburger menu, I assume you're all familiar with it, is that series of lines. It turns out it's actually a low-performing tool. The hamburger menu, most people don't recognize it. They don't know what to do with it. And it's because the problem is recognition over recall. People don't know what that looks like yet. I'm not sure when they're going to start figuring it out. It still has very low uptakes. What turned out to be much more effective was simply the word menu. Now, obviously, there's localization problems with that, but a combination of menu and then the hamburger, and then perhaps over time you could reduce it, allows you to get a significantly better click-through. Unfortunately, the data is white. Like I said, wrong deck. How about carousels? I noticed that more and more folks are starting to adopt carousels, both on their front page where they're selling their games. What's really fascinating about carousels is that nobody knows what those buttons mean. You know, those little dots, like why would I click on the third dot? None of those dots actually have any semantic meaning. And so I was talking to PJ, who works at Amazon, and the merchants always wanted carousels. They were really excited about using carousels in their design. But the problem was that they converted horribly. There's a massive drop down from the first slide to the second slide, which means if you're on the second slide, you're doomed, and if you're on the third and fourth slide, you're doomeder than doomed. And therefore, you go back to the problem of everybody fighting over wanting to be the first slide. So you shouldn't use carousels, except maybe you should. So they asked themselves, what if carousels worked? Which is like one of my favorite questions in the world. What would it look like if we could design a carousel that actually functioned correctly? And it turned out that the secret was, for Amazon, get rid of the little dots. Recognition over recall, and clear affordances. So they just made, instead of those little dots, clear pictures of what was behind them, and all the numbers went up. So clear affordances, recognition over recall. Use clear language. This is another problem I see in game design. People like the cute word. They want to make all the navigation on brand. Let me tell you, I've A/B tested this for 20 years. Just be obvious, be unsubtle. Be cute in the game, don't be cute in the menuing system. Contextual principles. So there was a wonderful talk given 2 years ago, I think, by the Farmville 2 folks, their postmortem. And they talked about what they called creative pillars. And they decided what was actually important to Farmville. So here we see, if you were designing a restaurant site, you know, what really matters? Well, a restaurant, you know, a recipe should be scannable. Users should know where they are in the recipe. You know, am I at the place where things are boiling, or am I at the place where things are burning? And you should be able to find the ingredients that you can buy. And what's really nice about this recipe is you can use the left-hand side as a shopping list, but then it also shows you where the ingredients are landing in the instructions. This is actually how Julia Child does all her recipes. So with Farmville, they came up with these creative principles that were all about your farm should be alive, it should always be in motion, it should be growing, it should be changing, and those drove every design decision. TiVo is also very famous for their contextual principles. And sadly, TiVo was incredibly successful. It was a wonderful experience. And then Comcast copied, it was like an opposite cargo cult. They copied all the functionality and none of the beauty. But it seems to have hurt poor TiVo. But it was very smart and they showed the way. So there are things you do as well. So in order to be more effective, you must observe in order to understand. You need to analyze. And then you need to create more things that then you can test over and over again. This is a quick sketch I do for my students. I hope that you all do play testing. I'm very shocked if you don't. I understand that there are game designers who don't do play testing. At Zynga, every Friday there'd be users there, and if you didn't have something for the players to play, your job was definitely questionable and on the line. And I'm going to just remind people that when I was at Zynga, they were not dying and miserable. They were healthy and exciting, and it was an interesting place to be, and I think they were very smart. Since I left, I can't really say what happened after that. I swear it wasn't me. I didn't break it on my way out. But that rhythm of play testing is absolutely critical, and what's fascinating to me is now that I'm teaching game design, I see students building games, and then it looks beautiful, it looks like it's going to work, the rule set's perfect, they test it and it dies. It doesn't play well. So it's the same thing with user experience. We must test and test and test. We must observe. There's a ton of methodologies that you guys can pull on observation. Contextual inquiry is one of my favorites. So as well, there was a woman who worked on the very first Farmville that Zynga released, and thank you. And she always talked about the fact that it was a one-handed game. Farmville and porn apparently are the two things that you consume one-handed for completely different reasons, by the way. So the reason you play Farmville one-handed is because you have on your knee a baby. And you're playing possibly left-handed, while you're bouncing the baby on your knee. So if you did not know that, you would build in crazy keyboard shortcuts, a lot of complexity. If you do not watch people in their natural habitat, you will not understand what's going on. And I think Apple and Google Maps both don't realize that their music and their Maps products are being made in the 2 seconds while you're driving. Because right now, every time I try to play a song while I'm driving, Apple tries to sell me a news or radio or something. So think about context. Usability testing, this should be a gimme. I will tell you, I play enough games to know that none of you are doing it. Finally, analyze your information. So I've got to say that this is a step that gets skipped all the time. It's not done very well. What I see people do is they go through their notes and they go, okay, we should fix these 3 things. I think it's incredibly important to take every insight and put it on your Post-it notes and then rearrange them and rearrange them and rearrange them. First, try taking all those observations about how people live and how people play and do a classic affinity sort. How do things kind of hang together? Then try doing it by frequency. How often do these things happen? By figuring out how often happens, you know what you really have to fix. What do you have to make better? Put it along a timeline. What does it look like at the beginning of the gameplay? What does it look throughout the gameplay? What does it look like at the end of the gameplay? It's classic Amy Jo Kim stuff, right? If any of you are old enough to remember her work about the player's journey, you know, you want to design every piece of it. So there are a lot of insights in the data, and every time you rearrange it, you see new findings and you discover new things. We are in a very competitive business right now. We have to find ways to be the best out there, and it's worth the extra 5 minutes rearranging Post-it notes to find a potential thing that might let you be successful. Finally, make things, make things, make things. Make things, make things. You don't know what's true until you've made it. So IA, UX, interaction design, it all hangs together. Observe and understand your people. Be sure that you can organize your content. Your menu systems need to make sense. Design the behavior you would like to see, and communicate clearly. User experience is really big. That's why Peter thinks that play is within it. But I think the very heart of user experience is actually really, really, really tiny. Just about the user's experience. Follow the known principles, finish with the user, test during design. Everyone must care for the user. So let's talk about it, and I would like to give you as many books as I can because they're heavy. So thank you. Thank you all. Also, read those books. Sure. Good fast move.
I was right there. So when we start making games, usually we start with like doing a rapid prototype of like the core mechanic and this kind of stuff. But my understanding of making things on mobile and web would be that you start maybe with like, you know, wireframes, paper prototype, personas, user flows, like this kind of thing. Do you think that the first steps we take to like building a game could be different and there's stuff that we're skipping?
Wireframes are a lie. Nobody should ever make wireframes. Stop making wireframes. They're not good for anybody. They're dreadful. Just no more. Sketch and then design. You don't need to make coloring books. Should you guys be making things differently? It's really funny because when I talk about learning from game design to UX people, I always talk about Bartle's persona types and engagement style, and I think it's really powerful. The opposite for you guys would be to think about the elements of personas that are always there. So what other tools do they use? What are they familiar with? What's their visual vocabulary? What are they technically savvy? Are they I worked on shockwave.com, and when they were trying to redo it in the 90s, they found out they had two kinds of people. They had tough young skateboarder kids who loved making things blow up, and grandmothers playing the crossword puzzles who would call customer service anytime anything was changed. And when they figured out that, they did choose what interface. They actually made the interface harder to drive away the grandmothers, which I think a lot of hardcore game designers are doing today. So I think that taking something for personas is good. Don't do wireframes. Just make lots of paper things. Make paper things and play with them. That's good. So come up and get your book, and I'll go to the other side. Yep. But if you find me later, I might have more. I'm going to have books. I'm going to have books every day. So you can find me later. It could be. Question?
Hi. A great talk, by the way. I have a question in terms of user experience and cross-culture. Do you find yourself finding new...
Questions. They're for questions. Find me later.
Challenges when you're actually featuring different cultures? Some of these principles are universal, but I'm wondering if they actually vary depending on the culture or geographic location you're in.
I heard that you're looking for what changes by culture, but is that just enough of the question?
That's enough of the question.
Okay, so yes, everything changes by culture. People have different dialogues that they use, and I'm going to have to put these up here because people want to grab them, and I know you want one, and I'm going to make sure they don't disappear. So, of course, everything changes by culture. We have different visual explanations. The problem with the word menu is it doesn't change, but we don't know, do those lines mean anything? We've always talked about gestural problems. If you have a character in your game and they're going, okay, this means F-offs in a lot of different cultures. So absolutely everything has cultural context. This is my point about intuition. There's no such thing as inborn intuition. Intuition is compressed experience, which means you have to examine the experience or else you cannot create an intuitive design.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. This side.
What's your feeling on interfaces becoming standard? So in the normal app development, things like the Apple tab bar is a standard, and in material design that's sort of set standard in games. How does that sort of translate in the sense that there's some pretty crazy menus out there? So things that are actually within a game world don't match like an Apple
I think
standard.
everything is incredibly contextual. So I ran into Dan Cook in the hall, and he said he was talking to a guy who was literally making games harder because they only want hardcore gamers, and they don't want ordinary people playing their games. I think there's an inherent classism built into our interface decisions, and that classism will reflect who's a real gamer and all those classical questions that are built into racism and sexism. So I think that as gaming becomes ubiquitous, we have to ask ourselves, who are these people, what language do they speak, and who do we want to talk to? You don't want to default into your audience, you want to choose your audience, and I believe that if you like money, you'd like to have a rather large audience. The other thing is that gamers are already anchored at a certain price point, but you can move that price point around if you can get new audiences, but that means you have to have the tolerance for onboarding them, which is a huge problem. I'll always remember the moment when my daughter was watching Nickelodeon and she said, "Mama, are you a gamer?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she goes, "Yay, can I be a gamer too?" And I just, that feeling. So I think that it is all our moral imperative to think about how are we bringing more people into the games. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, so, and also just games being the strange medium that they are, a normal Apple, the interface is pretty standard across most.
Why should your menuing system not be standard?
Yeah.
There's no reason to be sexy in the menu. You can be sexy in the game.
Yeah.
Don't be sexy in the menu. Okay. Yes. One more question.
Sorry. My question.
And then I'll go to the wrap-up room.
My question is about what do you think about testing interface before becoming 100% inside of the game?
All you need is the level of fidelity so that your users understand it. So the question's always going to be, how do I make sure that people can actually play with it? And the problem is that designers know too much. So they'll recognize what some strange little symbol means, and your users won't. So you have to pre-test it. Usually you want to find somebody else in a different part of the department, HR, accounting, somebody like that. Do a quick test. Try to make it enough fidelity to be comprehensible, but no more than that. Because the longer you spend making things, the more unwilling you are to change it. I don't know if you've heard of the IKEA effect. The IKEA effect says that the more effort we personally put into something, the more we value it and we'll overvalue it. That's why I don't let my students code. I want them to stay in paper because they're willing to rip things apart and toss it out. So.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we're off to the wrap-up room, right? It's, perhaps you can follow me and he'll tell me where it is. Yes? 2022. We'll go to 2022. I will be carrying more piles of books around all GDC. So feel free to accost me tomorrow. I'll try to bring like 50 of them. So please come find me.